Hi, everybody. This is Silvio Canto in Dallas, Texas, on Tuesday, January the 13th, and welcome to our commentary. I want to talk about a couple of things today. I want to talk about this new lawsuit that Minnesota is bringing against the federal government over ICE, and I want to talk a little bit about a post that I have over at the American Thinker today, talking about the incredible similarities between Cuba today, 2026 and Cuba in 1898. And if you remember 1898 from your history class, that was the year of the Spanish American War. So I'll get into that in a minute, but I want to begin with what is going on today and maybe for a few more days at the Supreme Court regarding men and women playing sports. Big debate. I guess somebody brought up a lawsuit against one of the states. There was a state, I think Texas is one of them, where they've banned it. In other words, men have to play in men's sports and women have to play in women's sports. You have to play in the sport of your birth, the sex that you were born. Men play here, women play over here. And apparently somebody is suing that. It's all the way up to the Supreme Court. And, a couple of reactions to all of this. First of all, there was a encounter today between one of the justices, I think Justice Alito, who was simply asking the question, what is a woman? And they couldn't answer the question. What is a woman? They couldn't answer it. They couldn't answer the question, what is a woman? And then of course the larger issue is that we're even talking about this. I mean, that we're going to the Supreme Court to argue something as common sense as this. That is gender. Men are men, women are women. And the fact that we're even taking this up in a Supreme Court tells you, frankly, the lack of common sense on the other side. I mean, look, if transgenders want to play by themselves in a special category, okay, if that's what they want to do, go right ahead and do it. I'm not going to oppose it. But if a man wants to compete in a women's sport, that doesn't fly because that man has a very significant advantage, as we have seen in many of these track and field races, swimming competitions, and so on. But the fact that we're even arguing this, the fact that there are people invested in this argument, there are people out there basically saying, yes, a man who identifies as a woman should be able to play as a woman. The fact that we're even discussing this tells you, honestly, about the breakdown in common sense on the other side. I mean, the fact that we're even talking about this, the breakdown in common sense. And I don't know how else to put it. How else to put it? This is not about civil rights. This is not about, you know, more opportunities for men and women. We all agree Title IX, something that was passed many years ago, guarantees opportunities for young women in sports. So that already exists. But we're not talking here about young men and young women. We're talking here about a young man who identifies as a woman, whatever that means. And the fact that we're even having a discussion about this, it's absolutely, absolutely incredible to me. So I'm assuming that the Supreme Court is going to support these bans and that states will be allowed to do like we do in Texas, where you have to play in the gender of your birth. I'm assuming that's going to pass. How it'll break down, I don't know. But it should be at least 6-3. It should be really 9-0. I mean, this is such an incredible issue that we're even talking about this. But anyway, interesting issue today before the Supreme Court. Now let's talk a little bit about a post that I have over at the American Thinker today, comparing Cuba today, meaning 2026, with Cuba in 1898. Now, as you probably know, there's a lot of people talking about the collapse of the Cuban government, that it's a matter of time. And back in 1898, if you remember from your history class, there was something called the Spanish-American War, and it started over the explosion of a ship in Havana Harbor. The USS Maine exploded there, and that created the reason for the United States to fight Spain. At the end of that very short war, Spain picked up Cuba, the Philippines, and Puerto Rico. There may have been something else too that I don't remember at this moment. So Cuba, during the next 4 years, was basically occupied by the United States. And during those 4 years, the United States more or less created a lot of the infrastructure, or reconstructed really much of the infrastructure, like the trains, for example, and many other things that allowed Cuba to then 4 years later become an independent country. And I think we're at a point right now where that may very well be the only solution, the only way that we can go. Whereas the United States will, let's see, oversee Cuba for a period of time, 3 or 4 years, sounds like a reasonable time to me, allowing the Cuban infrastructure to be reconstructed. When I say infrastructure, I mean everything. Everything. I mean, look at the power plants. They're losing electricity constantly because the power plants are not up to speed. They haven't not been modernized. So you've got 60-year-old power plants, literally providing electricity for the island. It's a disaster. You also have a lot of other infrastructure problems in Cuba, a lot of things that are just falling apart because they have not been addressed. And it has nothing to do with the embargo. That's not the reason why Cuba is falling apart. It's falling apart because of communism. So at the end of if the United States could come in for about a 3 or 4 year period, oversee the transition, and then pass the ball to a Cuban government elected under a new constitution, to me, that is the best way to go. That is the best way to go. And I think most Cubans will go along with that. You also have the reality that Cuban Americans like me will do whatever we can to support Cuba. And simply by traveling to Cuba, we'll be bringing, billions of dollars in cash to Cuba. And I think there will also be a lot of companies that will look at Cuba in a more favorable way. Up to now, much of the investment that we've seen in Cuba has been basically hotels and tourism, but nothing has been done to develop markets within Cuba. And I think a lot of that would happen if the United States were to oversee a lot of this. So I think there's a huge similarity between Cuba today, 2026, and Cuba in 1898. And I think if we look at the example back in 1898 of having the United States basically occupy the country for 4 years back then, and then having elections and having a Cuban government, I think that would be the best way to go, frankly, for Cuba. And I'm hoping that's what will happen out of all of this. The reality is that the Cuban government has no credibility with the Cuban people, and the country needs to start fresh. They need new faces. They just have to redraw the whole thing and start from scratch. And the United States would be extremely helpful in accomplishing that, especially when you have a Secretary of State in the United States who understands the Cuban problem as well as anybody, because he's a Cuban American whose parents came to the United States from Cuba, and he understands. He grew up listening to that whole story, just like I did, growing up with in a Cuban household. Well, I've got a post coming out tomorrow about what Minnesota is doing. Minnesota is suing ICE, calling it an invasion. It's not going to get anywhere because a state cannot stop the federal government from enforcing federal immigration laws, and ICE is not doing anything illegal. What I would recommend to Minnesota is, instead of suing the federal government, what they ought to do is work with ICE, as we do here in Texas and in many other places. Practically just about every place in the country works with ICE. And what that does is that you share the load, and you can help ICE do whatever they have to do. You can turn over to ICE the criminals, the people they're looking for, and then simply, let them process those, and you can take care of the people who are here. But unfortunately, that's not what Minnesota is doing, or Chicago and LA, because they see this as an opportunity to have a political argument with Trump. And I think in the process of doing so, they're creating quite a bit of really dysfunction in their city, to say the least. Now, there's another problem up in Minnesota too, but that's a separate problem, and that is this fraud, these allegations of fraud that are being made. I think that's pretty serious. And even the other day, I was watching the mayor of Minneapolis, and he said, yes, there is fraud, and we have to address it. So it's not just an idea; it is a reality that there's a lot of fraud up there that has to has to be addressed. Well, we remember, I'm 1 day late on this, 1 day late because it was actually yesterday. But Rush Limbaugh was born on January 12th, 1950. Rush, of course, passed away in 2021. Hard to believe that we're coming up on 5 years of Rush Limbaugh's death. But I always thought Rush Limbaugh was as good behind the microphone as anybody I've ever heard. I thought he was one of the best radio people in the history of radio. And whether you like him politically or not, that's another topic altogether. I did. I used to agree with him on most things. But whatever your politics was, his skill as a radio host, his skill to put together an entertaining radio show 3 hours a day for 30 years, that takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of skill to be on the air 30 years, as he was successfully putting out a radio show every day. So we remember Rush Limbaugh on what would have been his 75th or 76th birthday. What an amazing radio personality he was. As I say, I'm familiar with a lot of them because I have followed them. Paul Harvey is another example like that. But nobody did it better than Rush. Nobody was able to put together a show. Imagine doing a show for 3 hours every single day. Imagine the energy, the talent that you have to keep an audience as he did, a big audience too, as he did for 30 years. I remember about 30 years ago in the mid 90s, that you could travel throughout Texas. You can go, let's say, from Dallas to San Antonio, or Dallas to Houston, or whatever, and you could travel, whether it's the interstate or just some of the side roads, and simply scan your radio, and there would be one radio station after another carrying Rush Limbaugh. He was the meal ticket for hundreds of stations, particularly small towns across the country. And you didn't even have to do anything other than just hit the scan button, and it'll go around a couple of times or one time. And there was 1, 2, 3 stations carrying Rush Limbaugh and all those little towns in Texas. And I'm sure it was that way just about everywhere else. So Rush Limbaugh, the king of radio, as far as I'm concerned, I think he was born in Missouri, as I remember him saying that. Well, thank you for listening. This is Silvio Canto in Dallas, Texas, and we'll talk to you later. Bye-bye, everybody.